Okay, everyone, I think we're just going to get started. Hope everybody had a good lunch. It's actually a very bright light, but thanks for joining us here today. We're actually we're pleased to be here. I'm speaking with a partner, Mark Garrett, who's from Information Insights and who does advanced modeling really around marketing data. But we're going to talk about a really interesting new study that we're revealing for the first time today about using machine learning-powered social data for predictive analytics. And so there have been a lot of conversations around natural language processing, et cetera. Here are some very good ones that got deeply technical. Here we're going to talk a little bit more about a business application, a real live business application of where we're putting it to work for real client value. And so we should have some time for questions at the end. The quick introduction for us is I am not a data scientist, I must say. I am the founder and CEO of Conversion, which we've been doing social listening and intelligence for over a decade. We were the Forrester leader in 2010, strong performer 2012, 2014, and we've always been trying to harness the value of this unstructured, unprompted conversation to drive business value in organizations. And for years, we've been struggling with how do we get to data quality that's actually meaningful enough to be useful within large organizations. To do this, we actually partnered with Information Insights. And Mark, I'll let you do a quick introduction of what your team does.
Yeah, my company is founded about 12 years ago. Is on marketing analytics primarily. So coming to a data science conference quite like this with a technical emphasis is a bit new. But we specialize in models, so we've long sought a way to integrate, the social listening data in predictive sales models, which is kind of our forte. And that's where we saw a connection here in the broader area of business analytics.
I first want to start off with language. I mean, we're dealing with very complex data, unstructured, unprompted. It's always changing. Linguists still don't really quite understand how children acquire syntax. Language is always changing. If we divided this room in half and kept you apart for 500 years, you'd have different dialects. If we kept you apart for 1,000 years, you'd speak different languages. So it's a moving target that's changing, and slang and sarcasm and other things as well. But embedded within the language is symbolism and language and other things that are critically important for companies who are trying to really understand their customers. And it's a problem. In fact, Forrester says that companies are only structuring about 21% of their unstructured data. And probably for many of you, this is exactly what you're dealing with too. You're sitting on not just social data, but you have call center transcripts and other things as well you're trying to make sense of. So in the social listening space, that's been many of you are probably using some form, how many people are actually using some form of social listening data currently? So you're pulling it through some types of social listening platforms like a Crimson Hexagon or a Brandwatch or others and pulling the data through. The challenge has been, that was fine for kind of a public relations function. And Twitter is only making that available through certain types of agreements and contracts. And to access the data, you have to access it through generally one of these social listening platforms, or you can do direct connections through their GNIP group. But the problem has been for consumer intelligence folks, so folks who want to do modeling on this data or to be able to report with confidence to their executive team, the data has been really poor. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. And some of this may be familiar for you, but one of the, this is actually a true story that Science Magazine has written about, is that every time Anne Hathaway is being talked about online, a new movie comes out, Berkshire Hathaway stock goes up, because the challenges of separating or disambiguating Hathaway from Berkshire Hathaway's is problematic. Most of the approaches to date have used Boolean type structures to be able to try to separate those signals from the noise, and in our experience only get to about 15 to 30% of relevant documents. The other problem is that slang and sarcasm abound. So, when we talk about, and this is actually, something that we were analyzing, that, when you kill something, it's not usually so good. In this particular case, it's actually a good thing. So most of the automated sentiment solutions, which are using kind of rules-based techniques, are getting about 60% precision versus the human gold standard. We consider the human gold standard not to be an individual human, but 3 individual humans who agree on the same record. The other problem is that most of the word spotting approaches, or these rules-based approaches, are missing the implicit meaning. So You know, when I tell you I spend my entire lunch hour trying to exchange my ticket for American Airlines, you know it's negative and you know it's frustration, but there's no word in there per se that has been that says that. The other piece is that most of the analysis is being done on a record level or a sentence level. So, with this particular example, is something positive or negative? Well, it depends from your point of view, first of all. So, all opinion is seen through the prism. If it depends if I'm Verizon or Sprint. But it also has multiple opinions within a particular tweet or a particular sentence, and most solutions are only looking at that and calling it neutral or mixed because it isn't gleaning out what we call facet-level analysis in the data. So every expression of opinion needs to be evaluated. So because of that, if you think about it, you have 15 to 30% relevancy in the data sets, you have low recall in the data because you're not getting a lot of signals out, and your automated sentiment's about 60%. You can't really model that data. You can't really do much with it. And you're also stuck within the constructs of just very basic annotations, things sentiment and maybe emotion at some points. But this year has been a game changer. We've actually been doing machine learning since 2008. So we've been working at this problem for a long time of trying to evolve beyond these rules-based techniques. And we've built a massive trading corpus of several million human-coded records with 3 independent humans. So we've been working with this for a very long time. We see a big breakthrough happening this year, not just because of the application of machine learning and deep learning, which has been going on for a while, but we now have some of these new data science platforms that allow domain experts to build their own models on top of these corpuses to be able to get to high precision and relevancy and start to build out new types of classifiers that are actually meaningful to the business and predictive of business outcomes. So the transformation we see is instead of these rules-based techniques, we're obviously moved to machine learning. We take a semi-supervised approach to the data set so that we're always having humans in the loop. We're doing entity-level analysis, and instead of just having general classifiers for language, for English, et cetera, we actually have domain training specifically for different industries. So the word small is good for smartphones, not so good for hotel rooms. Unpredictable movies are pretty good. Unpredictable steering isn't so great. So we're building classifiers specific for industries and ensuring that every classifier that's built, and I've heard a lot of great talk about this here, so this is very validating to me, of creating F1 scores and validated models before they're deployed. For if you're using social listening platforms, it's usually this one-size-fits-all. There's no performance scoring. You're kind of looking at it, and it says, does the data look good? Well, not really. It's very difficult. The other piece is we're seeing instead of having these classifiers live within a platform, they're actually feeding into APIs and into multiple different platforms, ecosystems. So social listening platforms, business intelligence platforms, and other things as well. So we're really starting to be able to get descriptive. So the approach here is that all the data that you're going to see coming through here and all the data that was used in this study was first pushed through this training corpus of 3 million corpus or records that have been coded by independent coders over 10 years. So that's for emotion, intensity, and sentiment. Then we have an active learning approach where confidence scores are associated with each record, and they're put within a platform, which our platform is Conversus, where you're able to train the data up and customize it and actually then go further in terms of building custom classifiers. So we're really have put these tools into the hands of our clients who are the domain experts at the end of the day because their taxonomy is made different. The trust is different from one company to a different company. Empathy means something else to someone else. It's very difficult for us to build classifiers just in a kind of in a general way. We need their domain expertise. So what we have here, instead of using these Boolean queries on the left-hand side, that was generating about 15% relevancy in the data set. We're simply showing examples of is this relevant or not. This is for the word spam. Could we separate spam the food from spam the conversation? And within a few hours of training, built on top of the corpus that's already in place, they've got to 92% relevancy. But since we can do that, we can now build classifiers using machine learning for all other types of different types of variables in the data, which are really important. So, for example, advocacy. If you're doing net promoter scores, net promoter is essentially a promise to maybe say something nice about you. We're actually capturing actual expressions of advocacy, which is different than sentiment. We can do brand attributes. So, people don't often say, I trust a brand. They'll say, I use the product with my baby at night because my baby sleeps better, an expression of trust. So we can actually separate now in customer journeys, like where the conversation is happening. Is it the discovery phase? Is it post, et cetera, as well? And we have emotions around Plutchik's wheel of emotion. And perhaps what you're going to see here is really around motives, which we're going to get deeper into. So what we've been able to do now over time is to be able to get really pretty sophisticated in precisely classifying language that's really complex. This is out of the Pepsi commercial that Kendall Jenner did. You probably remember that. It didn't go so well. And you can see the conversation online. It says, for those of you who can't read it, yo, Kendall, I'm going to need you to come through with this Pepsi. These cops are wilding, right? So that there's not a Boolean type approach or rules-based approach that would capture that as anger, but you can see that here. All these are being generated with F1 scores. So for those of you who know F1, it's a combination of precision. That precision is against 3 independent humans who agree on a particular record. And recall, which is are we capturing all the expressions and all the records and all the signals out of the data set that are relevant for what we're looking for. And so the system can automatically, we do holdout sets, it can automatically provide performance scores associated with each model so that we can then start to build these into models in much more interesting ways. And what we're finding is that given this approach and given the tuning, that in general, and the classifiers are now outperforming individual humans. Humans, in our experience, are only agreeing on language about 60 to 80% of the time. It depends on the category. So there's great inconsistency. So for companies who have individual humans, and that's what they've been doing, is coding these records, the system is outperforming those individual coders on average. And it's bringing a consistency to it that you don't get from kind of an individual coder. So we spend a lot of our time thinking about how do we build non-discriminatory classifiers. And we're working more on that, and we're making sure, and I think that's a challenge, especially with GDRP coming in Europe. There's going to be more of a focus on making sure that we get this stuff right. So the question is, we've done all this stuff, but is this data can be predictive, right? It's been great. It's been used in market research for a while. It can do category analysis. It can tell you of the for example, smartphone conversation, how much conversation do each brands have, what's their sentiment, what's the emotion, what's the intensity, what are the topics, what are the emerging topics. We do a lot of organic topic discovery, so we can see what are topics that are emerging that a lot of more of the survey-based techniques miss, which often happens with kind of brand trackers. They may think they know their attributes, but they may miss something, and then they're stuck because they can't go back in time. But we can with the social data because we have 6 years of social data archived. So there have been some interesting studies that have come out around this, kind of going in this direction, because for our industry, when you talk about market research and insights in the companies that we're talking about, this is a big deal, and maybe for your company as well. Can we use this data to predict what the future, not just tell me what's happening today, not just about this crisis, but what happens next? Professor Wendy Moe, who was University of Maryland, took our data a couple of years ago and actually was able to say, can this data actually predict traditional survey-based brand tracking? And what she found is when she just took general sentiment, there was actually a negative correlation. When she cleaned the data up through machine learning for high precision, high recall, and actually built classifiers specific to brands and brand attributes, products and product attributes, and she made some adjustments in the model, she got to a 0.80 correlation towards predicting the traditional brand trackers. And so they won the MSI paper of the year. It's available online, but this is 2 or 3 years ago now. We also did a study with Analytic Partners, who does a lot of market mix modeling. Pepsi, Weight Watchers, a variety of other companies participated. And we provided the social data. And what they found was that on average, 13% of sales in these categories were being driven by forms of word of mouth, including social data. So, but those were all kind of interesting, but they weren't definitive. So the question we have here is, and our clients have, is there a way to prove more definitively that this machine learning, this machine learning powered social listening data can truly predict the future in more complicated categories in a much more definitive way? And so I'm going to hand this over to Mark, and we're going to share a couple of slides here before I hand it over to him completely. The first part of this, I simply want to say, is that our partners, Mark and his team, JP, who's here as well, helped us come up with what the motives were, because I think this was important. We wanted to go beyond sentiment and emotion. We did sentiment and emotion, but we also wanted to get into other motives to see if we could use machine learning to build classifiers specific to motives. We took 4 years of historical conversation data around the foodie conversation. So right, building classifiers to get the relevant conversation around the foodie conversation, getting 4 years of data, and then digging into making sure that the core classifiers for sentiment, emotion, intensity were highly tuned and precise. And then looking to build custom machine learning classifiers for the motives that they gave us in a particular category. And Mark, I'm going to hand that over to you to kind of finish up on this particular slide. Yeah, come on up here. It's lonely.
All right. We're doing this together. Yeah.
We are. Unrehearsed.
So, that's a bit loud. Bring this down. So the point of, we had already done quite a bit of work in the motive space for this client for a while, using very traditional methods, like using traditional data collection methods like survey-based, but a very advanced methodology using some behavioral economics methods that I was working on with Professor Greg Allenby that are able to identify the motive drivers of preference. And so we had a set of about 36 motives that we knew a lot about. You know, they ranged, you know, all over the board. Some had to do with convenience, some had to do with health, some had to do with ethical, you know, concerns about animal treatment or, you know, those sorts of things. Anyway, we got to understand these, and we knew that these were very strong drivers of preference. So we thought, is there a way that we can actually, you know, take a large corpus of social listening data, and in addition to the, you know, traditional, or I know these are pretty cutting edge too, the way you do sentiment analysis and emotional, you know, scaling, but also can we add these motives to it to develop a refined understanding? So we'll show you some examples later of exactly what that means. And then the idea is, once we have filtered the social listening data in a number of ways, we've actually made it useful for predicting new food trends. And so I think, you know, you've seen a lot of applications in marketing around trying to use social listening methods as a replacement for tracking studies. And so there's a lot of work around that. But this is a little different. This is actually trying to look at the innovation cycle in business and saying, can we actually speed up the innovation cycle by, you know, getting some sort of leading indicator out of social listening for the, you know, for the sales. I think you have one more.
Yeah. So we applied the machine learning to the data sets, and we were applying it in many ways to try to get to the nuances of the conversation. So we were trying to identify, how do we get to the motive, the language around motives, and then apply sentiment and joy and an intensity score on top of that, so we can really kind of classify the data in interesting ways. And as it was coming through the system, we're doing validation on the F1 scores and improving them over time. And what we were able to do here is now we get ourselves into the motives itself. So recognizable ingredients, we can't build a Boolean query saying, you know, I really am looking for recognizable ingredients. That's not what people are expressing. That's not how they're expressing. You can do it, but you're going to only find a few records. You're going to miss all the recall and all the nuanced opinions that you need to capture to do the modeling.
So yeah, this is kind of a modern motive. So a lot of people have health concerns, and you know, there's all kinds of health concerns around food. But we have to get the need states down to something quite specific in the food industry. So this is the idea here that if someone can actually see some food and it's not a mystery meat, or it's not, you know, it's not manufactured or industrial food, that it's got some evidence that it actually comes from natural sources. I mean, that may sound strange to you for around food, but that's, you know, people respond to that. So in order to do that, we need to understand the network of correlations around recognizable ingredients. So these comes from the same models. So we found statements like it was a healthy alternative to other options. These would be highly related. Doesn't look overly processed. So we were able to sort of develop a list of the core idea of recognizable ingredients, and then all the peripheral motives that are associated with that. and provide that as a very strong filter. And the other one I'll show too is another example of this is like comfort. So comfort is the goal of a lot of eating is about comfort. It's a very basic idea. It's sort of a one-dimensional idea. There's some very interesting things about comfort. So, there's differences between comfort and craving. So those may sound the same to you, but they would open up an entirely different set of posts and different classifiers. So craving is somewhat tangentially related to comfort, but is something different. So the thing that Rob and I, and with Rob's team, have been really working on is how do you combine the expert knowledge in any particular industry you're in? What's the right degree of expert knowledge that you need to actually develop good trainers, good training data sets, so that you can refine a set of posts to a time series that may be relevant to the trend you're looking for, because it's about trend prediction.
And I think one of the key drivers of success here is working internally just to establish the criteria of what comfort means to a particular organization, examples of what, and simply it's showing examples of what we think it means and showing examples of what we think it's not. And through that kind of active machine learning phase, bringing clients into that process, you're able to build classifiers built to their own taxonomy. So instead of doing just general classifiers, it is specific to their own through their own understanding of the world, and with high precision.
So one of the first things, one thing I learned about this machine learning approach was that there's a lot of dreck out there in social listening data. This is an example where we thought, let's just go and find out if there's a trend in curry. And so the main thing we found a giant spike in the data that was all basically a joke. And it was during the whole Brexit debate in the UK. And it was like, I hate all that foreign muck. I like good British food, like curry and Chinese. And that set off a viral joke. And that's just the sort of thing that will wreck your ability to actually predict sales. So here's a better example over here. What we're trying to do is, and we'll develop this example out. This is the vegan food. And so vegan food has been around for a long time. If you look at, the problem in industry is that people are using like simple Boolean approaches. They may try and, narrow down or get a better definition, but vegan food has been out there for a long time. So if you try and link it to sales, you're going to run into a lot of mistakes. Are you linking a general trend with a general trend that's not that interesting? Something's been growing over 5 years, that's not that interesting. What you're trying to do is actually narrow down some aspect within vegan that might be the latest manifestation of vegan and why it matters and what motives it's driving. So that's quite a different thing. Overall, our objective is this. We want to identify these big ideas and these turning points that are occurring. We then want to identify the ideas that are going to have sort of maximum potential for success. And then we want to just get ahead of trend. Because if you think of it, like the way that most CPG companies, for instance, that I work with, have gone to market, the way they've gone is usually late. And so they spend a long time trying to speed up the cycle time of the innovation process from the typical 3 or 4 years it would take to try and get it down to more like 2 or 3. And then they decided they weren't even good enough at doing that. I mean, if anyone here who knows the growth rate of CPG in the US for the last 10 or 15 years has been like 2% or under. And their record on innovation has not been that great. So lately they've been acquiring small companies that are willing to experiment, and they've been doing it by acquisition, which may still be it, but it's really critical here. How much lead time can I get on an idea is really important. Now here's an example from yogurt category from Chobani, and this, if I just get this working, this is just a Google Trends series over here. And this is like the history of Greek yogurt over here. So what we see over here is that in order to, this is when Chobani came into the market, and what Chobani did when they came in, they couldn't get space on the shelf for their product, so they created coolers on the floor in selective Western markets. And so they forced their way into the distribution system with some trial, and that began here. But they didn't take off under here until they started to get national distribution. You know, till Greek yogurt had already started to take off as a thing. And then it wasn't until here that the Greek yogurt actually started to get Dannon's interest, and they produced Stonyfield, and they started, you know, producing Oikos came in, and suddenly there were Greek yogurts all over the shelf. And that starts to happen here, up in this period. So products go through these phase changes. And we can see here in the Google Analytics trend, in order to be competitive with Chobani, you know, in the early days, you would have to have figured out that the trend was real right about here. You know, because that's the time it takes you to develop your own product or to acquire a company that makes that product. So even something like 90 days or 6 months of advance time is really important. So here in this analysis, here's what we did. We had a very big vegan data set, 4,700 products, sales over 3 years. And what we did is we had, in this data set, we have a descriptive label that we'll show you. And out of the descriptive label, we started to narrow down all the different, develop a taxonomy of products within vegan. Then we identified in 14 high potential attributes based on which vegan trends were actually had exponential sales trends. So we looked at volume, positive trends over the period, spikes that would sustain, and also these level changes, like state changes. And another, you know, we also looked at criteria like, was it one brand doing this, or was it across many brands? Then we generated time series for these, and we took the same criteria that, you know, the attributes that we were looking at, the sort of broad topic areas, and then used the social listening data with those same sort of topic constraints. Now, we use something called, I know how many of you have heard of Granger causality. It's, you'd have to be a mathematician or a time series person. But Granger causality is a very important concept because it's like, with social listening data, can I predict the food trend better than just the food trend on its own can predict itself? Because if something starts growing, exponentiating, why do I need social listening data? I already have the sales data. So can I get some lead time on it? So this is an example here. I said I work closely with my colleague over here is Juan Pablo, who has more expertise in linguistics and that area and the cross between applied mathematics and linguistics. We had the descriptive label, you know, for all these products. And so out of this label, we were able to identify things like here, the name of the brand, that it's a snack, that it's a bar, that it contains almonds and blueberries. And we had to do a number of things that were, frankly, new to me to disambiguate, you know, a lot of these things. And they made things like text normalization. There were a lot of times we were looking at concepts that were 2 words, like almond milk or meat substitute, you know, or gluten-free. So there's a lot of things actually that are portmanteau and double words in marketing, because marketing is not really satisfied with 1 word if they can like develop a nice phrase with 2. Then we use like several different methods to identify the food trends for behaviors of interest. And one of them is we want to see, we're looking for exponential trends. So over the 3-year period, things that were very areas within vegan foods that were taking off. Then we looked at another thing we're interested in were level changes. Oh, there it is. So in other words, this is very important. If something goes through a stepwise level change, that's almost more important because a lot of the social listening data that we see doesn't go through smooth changes. It goes through changes in intensity with high volatility, right? Then we developed other measures here, like how fast was this trend accelerating? So that's the point of maximum inflection. So we're saying how fast are these trends inflecting? The areas we're looking at, again, are very specific. So the areas where we found things of interest were, sometimes they were things that we expected. We know gluten-free is on trend. It's a rapid trend. We know organic has been around for a long time. But those two things are not generally of interest to manufacturers because they've known about them for a long time. What we need to find is something special, the latest manifestation, the latest thing going on within those general trends is more interesting to a food manufacturer. We found some things that were like really just surprising to us, like berries. I took a couple of pictures when I was in another client of mine in California, because California has a habit of always being on the cutting edge of food trends, especially, around vegan and organic. And so here's two examples. A freezer shelf full of berries, more berries than we get anywhere else in the country, more varieties, more organic berries that you can mix in with things. Also, like on the right over here was gluten-free. So this was the gluten-free of a chicken McNugget. So the farm-raised, humanely raised chicken surrounded with gluten-free breading in a non-trans fat. So what you're looking for is, a company is trying to replicate the pleasure of a chicken McNugget with all the right ingredients. This is also part of where you can think of recognizable ingredients like coming into play. So here's some of the data that really amazed us and showed that we were really on track to something very interesting. The green series over here is the social listening series. So that's the very refined. So in other words, it's a social listening series being identified with topic models. Then we've also used emotional filters, and we've also used these motive filters to get to specifically the conversations in social listening that are relevant here. And the blue is the sales trend. And what we can see here is that in the area of berries, those two series are very highly correlated, but a very interesting thing happens in the causality. What happens is that in the beginning, a social conversation can be predictive of the sales. But after a while, those sales take off, and the sales then become predictive of further social conversations. That's a thing in economics we call endogeneity, and it means the direction of causality can flip back and forth between what drives what. And that was a very interesting finding for us. We also saw the other interesting finding I've referred to a couple of times here for meat substitutes is that we see level changes. So something's going along, like the conversation's going along in purple there for a while with its volatility, and then suddenly there's a jump in the level of the conversation. In this particular case, if you can look in the green series, which is sales, there's a corresponding jump in the level of the sales. And, so imagine, the key thing is here, what we're doing here is we're validating the ability of social listening to actually predict the trend. But you've got to imagine a world in which, say, you don't have the sales data. In other words, you don't have the green line, and you're trying to place bets based on the blue line, right? Because you don't have the green line to prove that this thing is actually happening. So it becomes very important to see that if you have a volatile series and it makes a level change that is statistically valid as a change point, that may indicate an intensity in the conversation that could translate into a good bet, not for something that's brand new to the world, but something that already exists out there in its nascent form. It's already out there to some extent, but now it's going to pick up speed and go faster. More brands are going to jump on it, but it's still not to the point where a big CPG manufacturer would consider it, a slam dunk to get into it. Usually that would be like too late for them. Here's another one, another example of a level change. And this is like looking at a very specific need state within organic. And on this particular level change, we can, we have some lead times. And we're looking at, the ability of the social listening is anywhere from 1 to 3 months is what we're able to test. But 90 days is a world of time in trying to identify a trend and pick winners. This last one over here is gluten-free. This one is another example where we are able to solidify the correlation. So, correlation is, I know it's a way a lot of you talk of correlation, but because we're modelers, all of this series then gets embedded inside a pretty sophisticated model. So it's going to be a change point model or a dynamic linear model. So that's like a time series model that has changing parameters, is what that is. So what we need to know always is, does that social listening data, is it predictive of future sales? So we're after the future sales. And we found but correlation is a good bet. So you don't want to start the enterprise of building fancy models unless you have good correlation to start with. So here, you can see here that just with topic and sentiment, we had a 0.57 correlation. When we introduced the motive as a filter, we have a 0.86 correlation over in this particular area. So here, I'll just conclude here with, the main things we found. We found that if you have a good process and high quality machine learning, like we're able to do with Conversion, we could develop a social listening time series that was predictive of sales data. We could predict trends up to 90 days ahead of them. And sometimes it was that smooth exponential, and sometimes it was that level change. And that's the fourth point. The feedback loop is also a great finding, because what's chicken and egg here? Is a conversation just being generated because of some issues around the product that's already out there, or is there some native need that you're able to supply to your customers? Many filters were needed. The need state filter, I think, is new to the world and new to this conference, because I think a lot of you have seen sentiment data. A lot of you have also experimented, some of you have experimented with emotional data, but I don't think anyone in this particular community is thinking about using the need states to actually refine the conversations down to what is even more relevant. And I will say, it takes a certain amount of prior category knowledge to pick the right attributes and the right need states. So if there's, Rob and I are trying to work out, how much of this can be automated and scaled as a machine learning exercise, and how much requires those initial picks of the product attributes within vegan and the motives to be the right ones. That's kind of expert domain kind of stuff. And the idea is that, the trend is in its first stages. We're not talking here about some idea that's so radical and new that, you're sort of doing crystal ball prediction of brand new cool stuff. It's like, yes, I wish we had crystal ball prediction, but it's more like there's got to be enough evidence out there that someone is buying it in a small brand or somewhere, and it's consistent. So here we're trying to say, what's enough evidence to predict that it's scalable for a big company?
Yeah. No, what I would simply add is, I think one of the interesting points coming out from our standpoint has been there's been such a fixation on emotion and sentiment in most of the social listening. It is actually the custom machine learning classifiers around human need state that tend to be the predictors towards a deterministic outcome. And so what we're doing around that is our technology actually has an integration with many of the social listening platforms like Sprinkler and Crimson and others, so that these models, we're pre-building models around need states, making them available through those platforms to be able to do this type of modeling going forward. And it's certainly a work in progress, but that's where we are today. So thank you very much with that. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions if you have some. None. Does anybody predict? We have one back here. Yeah, no, actually, we did not. This was Twitter. It's also forums, news groups, et cetera, blogs, et cetera. It was the generalized. We didn't break it out. I don't think you broke it out by platform to see which is more predictive than others.
Not that I was aware of. We used your panel, so
Exactly.
that may be my mistake because I'm a marketing analytics person. For me, it's all like this social.
Yeah, it's been generalized. If you look at the Wendy Mo work, they made a little bit of adjustments in the model because Twitter tends to be a little more positive, for example, in forums. It depends on the domain that you're talking about, but generally we're processing hundreds of millions of social listening conversations, public social conversations a day. We're not going into your Facebook. We're not Cambridge Analytica. We're not doing that stuff. So
yeah, it's not private conversations. No,
yeah, exactly.
It's but I mean that's a good point because food is there are a lot of foodie blogs. There's a lot of discussions around food and trends. So even in the public domain, you can get a lot of things. It doesn't always happen that way. We talk to a beer client, and the conversation in beer can all be around what's the latest IPA, what's the latest cool microbrew, which is not what the big beer guys actually are doing. They may be coming out with soda pop or importing something new, or sometimes it doesn't align, but food is a great area where there's a lot of public knowledge.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Okay, we have a couple here. Maybe you'll take the mic. There you go. I saw somebody throw this earlier today.
Hi, I was just wondering, like when you get started initially, how do you decide the attributes? Because that's the toughest part and there's like so much data out there. So how do you decide like a bar and almond milk and those are the important terms or attributes for a particular product?
Do you want to talk to that, JP, as well? I mean, I can give it a stab. My colleague over here is also, that's where I talk about the expert knowledge of in these particular food domains, we have a good idea of the attributes going in, but sometimes the new ones are interesting, and understanding what is just trivial or weird and what is actually new and fruitful, that's a hard thing. I don't know. You did it, so how did you do it?
So there were different challenges for these. One was that we wanted to make sure that if we had a trend, because we generated like a lot of trends considering different attributes, but we wanted to make sure that if, for example, we were looking at berry, that particular time series was not driven by a particular brand, right? That it was not just one brand generating the trend. So we wanted these to be like something more general that could be observed in the listenings. So, for example, one metric that we generated was the Herfindahl index. So then you can see like the concentration, like for one particular attribute, for time series of containing the attribute berry, what's the concentration of brands, right? So you want that it's diversified. So that's just one example. We were looking at different metrics. And
you know what, JP? I don't think we mentioned that. In terms of attributes, we had frequency analysis of the text from the labels. We had many thousands of potential attributes, every single one of which was examined to see if it was possibly linked to a food trend.
Right.
So there's a big sort of screening exercise that goes on first within the product label. I'm not sure that was clear.
And if I can add with that, one thing that we often do is we'll just simply take a bunch of the data and do an organic topic discovery within the platform to see what's kind of emerging organically in the conversation so that we might know what to look for. And so when people are doing brand trackers, they think they know what their attributes are, but they may be missing something. So it's, that's, a technique that's been discussed here at length in some other sessions, but that's been very useful as well as a starting point. Other questions? Well, I think I can point over there. I don't know if that happened in this particular case. You could talk about a couple of those.
No, I think There are so many misses that it's hard to actually enumerate the misses. Because, like only 3 to 5% of new products even survive the first year. So getting better than that. I think the idea is just to develop a better set of potential winners to bet on. So no, we don't. I wouldn't say that we have. If you look at the history of like basis forecasting or traditional new product prediction, they'll be able to say they were right within plus or minus 20%, but we're not at that with these sources of data yet. So I think the idea is just to produce a better candidate set at this point of trends.
This was done on English language data. It'll be expanded to other languages. The techniques we use that we talked about, it's available in 12 languages, and including Chinese and Japanese and Arabic and other things as well. The nice thing is you all know with machine learning, we can adapt to new languages pretty quickly. So that's where it starts today. And I think that's where, in terms of the maturity of most of the organizations we work with, they're trying to get it right in English before they start to expand in some other languages.
It's funny you say that, because some of the other categories we're looking at were like Mexican and tacos and things like that. And you will get a lot of what I call creoles, they're mixtures of languages. They're total, it's urban languages, you get a lot of things that are interesting, kinds of discussions when you get into ethnic foods, right? And those are going to be interesting, and then you get a lot of like red herrings, like the curry joke, too.
Yeah. But as we move forward, as all of you here, we're looking to do this in additional categories and proving this out a little bit more definitively, understanding additional motives. And so we think this is going to be a collaborative process, both working with some academics, but others, folks like you, using this data in interesting ways. And so we hope we have that chance to partner with you. If you're interested in this, we'd love to talk to you down the road. Another question. No, the question was, what's the business model for us? We used to do all this in-house, so we're more of a consultancy. Now we're a SaaS solution. The Conversus platform that we showed you, where all the models were built, is available for use. You build your own models, and I think that's really what we learned from that process is simply we can't scale given the amount of taxonomy and nuances in terms of the the type of classifiers that need to be built at large organizations. Empathy means one thing to someone else, and it means something to someone else. So we want to put it in your hands, not ours.
On the other side, on the sales side, this relied on IRI data, which is syndicated data from the food business, which comes from electronic point of sale data. Do you try and go after, sources of loyalty card data, electronic point of sale sold by specific retailers? There are many sources to try and capture the volumes as well, which make the problem like a double. That's the other side of the problem.
Basically, on the social listing side, like all social listing platforms are pulling data from essentially the same places. You can do custom crawls, you can do some things like that. Some places do forums better, some places do review sites better, but it's essentially public social conversation data. This technology is also being pointed at other voice of customer data within the organization, so your call center transcripts and long-form survey verbatims. It's a text analytics platform, so it's machine learning powered. That's where that goes. But to your point, I think the other thing that we're actually moving towards is building a lot of pre-built models. So if you're an automotive for purchase intent, there's a model you can buy, but then you can modify it, validate it, modify it, deploy it. Just really accelerate your use of using these classifiers instead of trying to build stuff from scratch. Because right, there's all of that, and also, again, this is 10 years of, intercode or human-coded data for years and years that you're pulling on, and as you all know, that's, that's not easy to replicate in an effective way. So we're just putting these tools in your hands, or the models in your hands, and modify them and use them and deploy them and subscribe to them. That's all. Great. I think we're about out of time. Maybe there might be room one more question if anybody has one, or not. We're here. I guess cocktail hour. We have to catch our flights. No cocktail hour today. But anyhow, thanks everyone.
Thank you all.